5 total overtimes since the last time we hopped on the microphones, and we know one team that's advancing, 2 more looking for their spot. We'll talk about that on today's episode of the Women's Hockey Report.
This is the Women's Hockey Report presented by Locked On NHL. Your weekly look at the world of women's hockey. From the PWHL to the international stage, it's the Women's Hockey Report on the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello, women's hockey fans. Welcome to another episode of the Women's Hockey Report, part of the Locked On NHL channel, which is part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where we bring you your favorite team every single day. My name is Erica L. Ayala. I am your host here alongside Rachel Donner. All right, how you doing, Rachel? Let's do a vibe check.
I am wanting to live in Gwenneth Phillips' world. That's what it is. I mean, first off, like being as self-depreciating as she is after that overtime game, you know, in terms of her play in it, and then to come back with that shutout performance, like I want those vibes to be with me at all times.
I hear that. I mean, the vibes are good. I also love her response. And I feel like we kind of told you, athletes definitely care if they get called out in the PWHL format, as much as Carla McLeod might say otherwise. Gwenneth Phillips gave us the real deal. I also am pretty excited that the WNBA season starts this week. I will be in New York for the banner and ring ceremony, so I'm pretty hyped about that. Want to let you know that this episode of the Women's Hockey Report brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $200 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. I don't know if you put any money down, listeners and viewers, on these PWHL games, because you can do that at FanDuel. But if you had Minnesota advancing to the second ever Walter Cup with an opportunity to defend their title, then good on you. They also, that the first overtime that we're going to talk about on today's episode, I mean, you mentioned the 4 quadruple overtime with Gwenneth Phillips, but we're going to deep dive first into the most recent and the one that allowed Minnesota to advance, a 4-3 win over the Toronto Scepters. This had a lot of back and forth. We saw a new netminder. I think Toronto also, they were making all kinds of different changes throughout this series, truly trying to get a win so that they could survive. It would be, though, to no avail, despite getting on the board first. Minnesota clawed back twice over, Rachel, to force the overtime and then eventually get the win.
Yeah, I think what was interesting for me was kind of the difference between the third game and the fourth game in the series for Minnesota, because I feel like in game 3, they got a lot of contributions from all over the lineup, right? Where in that game, you had Brooke McQuigg got 2 goals. Michaela Cava from the top line got 2 goals. Liz Sheppers on the fourth line got a goal, right? And then you have Lee Steckline scoring. And it was just like this huge scoring game from all over the lineup. But then when it came down to it, in Toronto, like at home, so they didn't have to travel anymore, who steps up? Your top players. Kendall Coyne Schofield, Taylor Heisey, like that to me shows like the leadership and the experience and why they're the defending champions, because those are the kinds of players that can step up in those circumstances, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I thought it was interesting also and funny, a little comical that, Ken Klee, I don't know if he was 100% joking, but he definitely mentioned that, Kendall Coyne Schofield wanted to get it done, did not want to have to travel back to Toronto, to your point, and effectively was saying something to the, to the point, I've been away from my child for long enough. If I don't have to leave Minnesota, tomorrow, then that's what we're going to do. We're going to win this game. I'm going to spend time with my child and keep it moving. So, in the NHL, it's a big thing sometimes to talk about, like, your dad power tapping in, especially after you and your partner have a child, whether it's their first, especially I suppose the first, but throughout. And so I think that mom energy hits different. It's not just after the birth; it's probably for life. So that was awesome. Just a little anecdote to hear there. I think Minnesota is a team, and we talked about this a little bit. You just hit on it, that they know who they are. They stick to that, and that can be very empowering if you're in that locker room, and it can be very tiring if you're playing against that.
Right.
And I think that's what we saw a little bit in that game where Toronto it was a must-win situation, and they just they couldn't find it. I do want to talk about Toronto though here a little bit. Alluded to it, that they were trying a few different things. That includes giving this must-win game to a netminder that we only saw once prior, and that is one Carly Jackson. Now, I thought CJ did great. I mean, this is a tight game that goes into overtime. I think that if you also look at the shots and what Minnesota was able to do at times in this game, especially in that third, lots of shots coming in on CJ, lots of also shots that even if the tally wasn't higher than what Toronto was putting up, I do think that the quality, the high danger was different. Or I don't know if you want to say different, because again, it was a pretty intense game, pretty tight game. But I do think that it was noticeable that there were multiple sequences where Toronto was putting Jackson and their goaltender in a situation to have to make a very big time save, very significant save. Also, just the timing and the pace of things. But what do you make, Rachel, of seeing Jackson in the crease once again? And if this should be a storyline to this loss that was a must win for the Scepters.
Absolutely, it's a storyline, and I agree. Carly Jackson should have gotten more starts during the regular season, and I think that Campbell, she was struggling a little bit. And I think that, when you're making these adjustments, you have to think about also the play in front of your goaltender. And when you only play a goaltender once during the regular season, and then in a high pressure situation, put them back in a must-win situation like that, players have to adjust their game in front of different goaltenders. And so it's not just, is Jackson a better goaltender at this point or a better option in net here? You can make that argument one way or the other, but it's how do your skaters adjust their game in front of your goaltender? And do you want to make them do that in this particular situation? I think it's an interesting question.
Yeah, that is definitely an important way to think about it. Everything from how they communicate to if they're able to
How they defend.
Right. Or how they move the puck, if they move the puck, right? You have, I think about the NHL team that I cover, like Joey Decord. We know he's going to talk. We know he's going to move the puck. To your point, that's a very different situation than a Philip Grubauer who's like, I ain't got to touch it. I ain't touching it.
Right. I mean, the Flyers could say a lot about that too, but
Yeah. But I think I agree with you. It's definitely a storyline. I will also say, like you alluded to it, but my hot take is that Carly Jackson should have gotten starts in the regular season. There were opportunities. And why do you give goaltenders that you trust starts in the regular season? So that then you can trust them. And to your point, the team knows how to play in front of them if and when it comes down to crunch time and you need them to get you a win. So, we did hear from Troy Ryan after the game. He talked about that decision and talked about how some of the decision-making process is going to stay internal, which we respect that. But it was a conversation. I think that the broadcast, we heard a lot, of course, that the two netminders support each other. I will also say I found it so frustrating at times that the broadcast was just kind of illuminating that they didn't really know much about Carly Jackson and her style of play prior to, as if there's not like an entire league that existed where you could also just look up her stats and figure that out. But that was a little bit frustrating. but also understandable because there's no eye tests, there's no real PWHL vibe to go off of. And again, Toronto put Carly Jackson in a position in the first game where some people, I will say it this way, the conversation and a part of the conversation was also, was this always going to happen, or did this just happen because the team didn't need that win to then put Carly Jackson and CJ in a position where they absolutely have to win? I mean, that's night and day, right? That's a night and day situation. Now, how much that was the thought process for Toronto, we just have to trust what the team is saying. Because again, we can talk about that till the cows come home. But if CJ knew, regardless, that she was going to start that last game of the regular season, then it's, then that's good. That's good. The Toronto had that all sorted. But it definitely was interesting. I think that the grit of Minnesota just, it was unmatched by Toronto. And that's hard to say because I think they're individual players that played well, that they did what they could. But the grit level, I think, was really the X factor here. And that's because it's the playoffs.
Right. And you saw that in the third period, especially of game 4, where Minnesota just took over. I mean, you saw like the shot totals just flipped pretty significantly, right? And you saw that with the eye test too, that, the action was tilted, the shot quality, to your point, went up. And, that's what a championship team does.
Right. I think even on the broadcast we heard, right, like one team kind of playing to win, one team playing not to lose. And that's a totally different mentality. And it's unfortunate for Toronto that once again, I mean, not to make it about the MNHL, but we already know that Toronto.
Oh God, I hadn't even thought about that, to be honest.
I don't know. It's a very, very
something in the water.
Small sample size. It's insignificant statistically, but I mean, again, these are how storylines are birthed. Toronto has yet to make it out of the first round, which is the semifinals, at least for now, of the PWHL. So, another thing, Rachel, that I noticed in both series that I want to talk about after we talk about that quadruple overtime thriller is, should the home team, or excuse me, should the higher seed be the home team in games that are potentially going to clinch a series? I think this is a conversation people have throughout sports, especially as the money continues to roll in. So we're going to talk about it here on the Women's Hockey Report.
The NBA, the NHL, and PWHL playoffs are all in full swing, and every night delivers highlight-worthy performances, major momentum shifts, and those can't-miss moments. And whether it's a game-winning goal or overtime drama that we've been talking about, there's never a better time to get in on the action. FanDuel makes it easy to stay in the game before puck drop and live with player props, performance trends, same game parlays. Fans have even more ways than ever to play smart and win big. And that $200 in bonus bets, if your first $5 bet hits, could allow you to win even more on future game bets. Who will win the Conn Smythe? Which team will win the Stanley Cup or the Walter Cup? You make your picks and you can win that extra cash. So if you're new to FanDuel, it's the perfect time to sign up. Head to FanDuel.com, place that first $5 bet, and if it wins, you'll get $200 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, official sports betting partner of the NBA.
All right. So, Rachel, we talked about Minnesota advancing. Again, Toronto just can't quite get over that hump. Will that make them hungry for next year? I can only imagine it will. Minnesota gets a chance to potentially repeat as champions, but of course, they have to go through the winner of the Montreal-Ottawa series. So, again, want to talk a little bit about home ice advantage and the higher seed. We'll get to that. But first, we've alluded to it a few times, but I mean, what is a word or phrase that you would use to describe quadruple overtime in this series? Montreal getting their first playoff win in their very short PWHL history.
Exhaustion. I don't know what else. I just physically hurt so much. Like once, especially it got into that third overtime, I was just like, how are they even vertical at this
Yeah.
point?
Yeah.
Maybe it was the mustard.
I was
I
gonna say
guess that's what we'll chalk it up to.
that's my one word is the mustard. Having the mustard is gonna have a whole new meaning for me now. I learned something. So for those who maybe don't know what we're talking about, when you are playing a hockey game or exerting any kind of physicality at that level, I would imagine you're losing electrolytes. You've got to stay hydrated. You've got to keep things going. And apparently mustard is a really good way to keep your engine running. To get the electrolytes, to make sure you're not cramping. I am not a fan of mustard, I must say. And maybe I'm going to have to be, for those tough times when you find yourself cramping in quadruple overtime in order to even up a PWHL hockey series. Now, I don't know when I personally would ever be in that situation, Rachel, but that's exactly
Listen,
what we saw.
I hate mustard personally. Like I cannot stomach it. It tastes gross to me. So I like that alone is unfathomable to me.
Yeah, I'm with you. I mean, all the mustard lovers, that's great news for you. Terrible
Yeah.
for us.
Yeah.
Be like, gotta find another way. Give me our lemon, orange, lime slices, whatever it takes, and some salt water. But let's talk about how this game played out. Now, we had made note of a few different things when it came to this series and Ottawa getting that first win, including that, Montreal and special teams. We talked a little bit about that. We talked about Ottawa and, being maybe a little bit too direct and not finding as many opportunities to get the defense moving, to maybe find second, third chances. So when you look at a quadruple overtime, and also very curious how the proponents of a shootout like myself feel about this. I mean, I'm gonna just stop there for a second. Like quadruple overtime, you got people freaking taking shots of mustard. I'm so hopeful that no one has a significant injury, because that is just like a form of torture. They played more than 2 hockey games, longest ever in the PWHL. How are you even walking straight, let alone playing hockey? Like that's insane to me. But I digress. Things got started with Montreal. They were able to take a 2-0 lead, Rachel, into the third frame. And then that's when things popped off for the Charge.
Right. And, obviously you want to talk about Brienne Jenner because I think that she has proven why she's a leader on this Ottawa team. And of course, she's the one that stepped up and got that game tying goal with less than a minute left in the game. And she had the assist on the previous goal to get them back in it, which again was with less than 5 minutes left in the game. And I think that she has emerged as one of my favorite players of the playoffs right now. And I think that, we talk about Gwenneth Phillips and we've talked about a lot of the Czech players on that team, but like Brienne Jenner has taken this team on her shoulders and carried them through this series.
Yeah, I would agree. I love your point about leadership. Brienne Jenner has really been that since jump for this Ottawa Charge team. Great size, isn't afraid to use it.
Yep.
Just is the kind of player that with what they do on the ice for sure. I'm not ever, on the bench or the dressing room with Brienne Jenner, but like just kind of, it's like a shot of adrenaline, right? Like you see how hyped and how hard Brienne Jenner works at times, and you just want to like run through a freaking or skate through the wall, right? And so that was fantastic to see the captain. We there was a little nugget. I guess it was in the Minnesota Toronto game where Minnesota advanced. We got a nugget that now captains of all 4 of the at the time remaining teams have scored in this postseason. And I think also you talked about with Kendall Coyne Schofield, like critical goals, right? For their teams. So I love that. I think if I look at this game, another thing is Laura Stacey. I mean, in the series, Laura Stacey has been fantastic.
Yeah. And, I know that we're talking about the awards in another segment, but Laura Stacey, I just have to say that name again because
I mean, just the grit, always getting to the net, had in that game that we were talking about 12 shots on goal, most in the game, or 12 shots, excuse me, in that game. But also, I love when we have a defender that scores, Rachel, and Aneta Teralova. As you said, we're going to talk about awards. This is another player that is just fantastic for this Ottawa Charge team. A team where we have continually, I should say, talked about their inconsistency. I think Teralova is head and shoulders one of the most consistent players on this team as far as skaters, because we can make an argument obviously for Phillips,
right.
But Teralova getting up in the attack, and that's kind of I think something that Teralova probably could do more, or if Ottawa can find a way for Teralova to do that more, I think that would be huge. Not in a way that's going to outbalance what she's able to do defensively, but if you have a solid partner, if you have a solid form, how you're attacking and your formation and things of like that nature. I think Teralova has shown that she can be someone that helps with the attack. We also seen that in how she's been able to facilitate the puck in the regular season. So just wanted to give some stick taps there. But that's the prelude, I guess, to now the situation where Ottawa on the road, or excuse me, Ottawa at home, Montreal on the road, looking to take a lead after they get their first playoff win. But it was the Charge with that home cooking, the home crowd. They had a fantastic crowd. The Montreal-Ottawa series by far had the best crowd, I think.
Oh, for sure. For sure. On both rinks.
At both rinks. The Minnesota crowd was on the sparse side, and it was, you could see it anyway on the cameras, like just where the cameras were set up. That was a little surprising. I mean, also it's like, a Wednesday night. So, but I thought that you mentioned it before, right at the top, Gwenneth Phillips feeling that in a quadruple overtime game that she let her team down, gave up 2 goals in 40 minutes. So decided that couldn't possibly perform any worse, I guess, Gwenneth.
Right.
So the only option in her mind was to pitch a shutout, as they sometimes say, and get Ottawa a series lead with a chance to clinch on home ice.
Yeah. And I think, one thing we didn't mention about the Minnesota-Toronto game that clinched this series was that it was a clean game. There were no penalties, right? So that didn't come into play. But in this third period, like things devolved a little bit, like a penalty a period for the first 2, that's fine. And there were like 4 penalties, like 2 were coinciding. Of course, there was like the Laura Stacey penalty, and then there was roughing and retaliation on that one. But I just feel like the game got a little discombobulated, and Montreal kind of got thrown off their game a little bit, partially because of the physicality of Ottawa, which is, we know that's something they've used all year long. Right.
Yeah.
And
exactly.
so I feel like ultimately, even though Ottawa was the one committing some of the penalties, including the aforementioned Brienne Jenner, I think ultimately that kind of energy is what fuels Ottawa in a lot of ways. And ultimately, I think led to the game-winning goal.
Yeah, that's a really good observation there as well. Another fantastic game. We said another fantastic crowd, another great performance from Gwenneth Phillips. I do though want to talk about two things before we move on. One, I alluded to, well, both actually I've alluded to. The whole you picked us. You picked us. I love that after this game, or during the game, the crowd in Ottawa starts chanting, Rachel, you picked us, you picked us. And after the game, Carla McLeod and the players were asked about that. And they were all like, wait, that's what they were saying? Which is just like, I mean, facts are facts, right? We, of course, heard Carla McLeod again say, hey, this is, they were given a task that's what they chose to do. But the players definitely leaned into that a little bit, but it got me thinking about the second point that I wanted to bring up, and that being, I have never been a fan in any sport of the team with that comes in as the lower seed having an opportunity because of the scheduling to clinch a title on home ice. I think that you give the advantage to the higher seed. I feel like, I don't know when we got away from that as like a sports community.
I don't know. I mean, I guess, I mean, at the risk of having another thing that teams get to pick, which I know is like impossible to do because of building schedules. So this is just like an academic exercise. But if teams could pick what they deem to be home ice advantage and say we would prefer, it's almost like the coin toss situation in football, or choosing to receive versus kicking off in the NFL.
Yeah.
Like, do you deem home ice advantage to be the first two games or the second two games?
Yeah.
That's your call. And then we'll make the schedule accordingly. But
that's a good point.
I think that you could see it both ways in terms of whether you'd prefer to clinch on home ice, but maybe you need that game 5 to do it and you want that at home. So
that's what I'm saying, right? So I mean, I think that certainly what we've heard on the WNBA side of things, I mean, the fact that the Indiana Fever, who eked into the playoffs, were mad that they didn't get a home game, even though they got swept anyway in their playoff series. But magically, Caitlin Clark and her teammates want a home game. So now we're doing a 1-1-1 situation for a best of 3 series in the first round of the playoffs. That's too much travel for a 3-game series. If you want to give the lower seed a home game, I think they get the first game. You get to make your money, right? You get the fans get to see you, and then that's it. Or whatever, I guess the equivalent here, since this is a 5-game series, is the first 2 to the lower seed and 3, 4, and 5 at the higher seed. But again, I don't know. Maybe I'm the one who's a little old school, because that's how it's always been, right? I will say, also covering the ECHL, they're like, yeah, we just go by whatever rink is available. So if it's a whole series somewhere else, then
how far the bus has to go.
Right.
Right.
So they're like, yeah, ain't nobody got time for feelings. You're either gonna win or you're gonna lose. I don't know what to tell you.
Right.
But definitely interesting. But we've talked about a lot of players, and a decent amount of the players that we've mentioned are on what are the 3 categories that we know now. As of the time we started this recording, we now have 3 different categories where finalists have been announced. We'll talk about that as we close out this episode of the Women's Hockey Report. We talked about how Hilary Knight had a fantastic season, especially surged towards the end. We can't get enough Gwenneth Phillips. And I mean, also, we talked about players like Renata Fast, who've had a fantastic season as well. Wouldn't you know, all 3 are a part of the 3 categories where 3 finalists per category have been announced by the PWHL for end of the year awards. Now, we already know that the the regular season champion, if you will, kind of awards have been announced. That's just outright who had the most points, who had the most goals, etc. But now we have Defender of the Year finalists, Forward of the Year finalists, and Goaltender of the Year finalists. For Defender of the Year, Renata Fast, Sophie Jakes, Claire Thompson. So Jakes and Thompson move on. For Forward of the Year, we have Fillier, Sarah Fillier, Hilary Knight, and Marie-Philip Poulin. Only one of those players, MPP, in the playoffs still. And then for Goaltender of the Year, you have Enrene Desbiens, Aaron Frankel, and Gwenneth Phillips. 2 out of those are head-to-head in that Ottawa-Montreal series. What do you make of this? Do you like these picks in the categories? Do you think anyone was snubbed?
Well, it's hard to say in some ways, right? So for the Forward of the Year, you basically take the top 2 point totals, right? And then you look at the third place point total, right? That's Daryl Watts, right? Not there. But Marie-Philip Poulin had the most goals. So you bump Daryl Watts for Marie-Philip Poulin and throw her that bone because that's a good achievement, right? It's not like it's an unfair thing to want the player with the most goals in the season in your top forward category. But it's really hard because it's not like an MVP situation. It's just pure play as a forward. So does Marie-Philip Poulin deserve to be there? Yeah, she kind of does. So, but you also don't want to
be there. Yeah, she does.
Yeah, I know. That's the thing. That's the thing is that with only 3 slots, like somebody's going to get hosed here. And it was Daryl Watts in this situation. And, I think if you're looking at pure points for this, and, you can't really do that in a lot of ways. You have to look at other stats. You have to look at, more well-rounded game, situational stats. And, one could argue like Daryl Watts was a -2 on the season. Everybody else was even or at a positive and plus minus. The other thing too is Sarah Fillier, right? 29 points, sure. Tied for the lead in regular season points with Hilary Knight. That's why they got the point award together. Sarah Fillier had 35 penalty minutes this season, right? And so Marie-Philip Poulin had 21, Daryl Watts only 12. So, is that a factor that should be considered? You can make that argument. Yeah, that's for sure.
Marie-Philip Poulin, I mean, something we didn't talk about when it comes to the playoffs, but I mean, the amount of face-offs, right, that MPP took in that quadruple overtime game was insane. And that, I think, also speaks to how much trust, how much responsibility do you have? Now, is that dependent on if you're a wing or a center? In this specific case for face-offs, sure, yes, it is. But for the fact that, you also are someone who plays center, so you have more understood defensive responsibilities, right, than arguably a winger, and you're taking face-offs. Are you winning those face-offs? Because how many are you taking? How many are you winning? I think I get where you're coming from. I don't know that I would love to see Daryl Watts as a part of this conversation. And when you cut that at 3 is the field all forwards? How did we get to 3? Who's selected the 3? I mean, those are things process-wise that I think, would make a compelling conversation as well.
Yeah, and I think they kind of got stuck because of the tie with the most points of having to put both of them in this category as well. And I think that's ultimately what happened here, in my opinion.
That's fair. I mean, it's a fair observation. Is it fair for the players? We keep going back and forth. I think for goaltender, this seems right to me. The three finalists for goaltender of the year.
100%. I mean, Desbiens, Frankel, and Phillips. That's it.
Yep.
No argument.
We had a lot of conversation about Corrine Schroeder, who a part of those conversations is when Schroeder is on, when Schroeds is on, she is on. And when she is off, man, that thing looks brutal sometimes. And there was a blip there in the season where Schroeder was not the most reliable netminder for her team, but then got it back. So you love that bounce back. And in a short season, when you have other goaltenders playing as well as they did,
right?
I think the thing maybe that you could say is this is a regular season award, right? Phillips, how many starts comparative to the rest of the field, including, Emmerance Mashmeyer, who had some fantastic games for Ottawa and had been that ace for them, and then injury changed that towards the back end of the season.
Right. But I think that's part of the credit that you're giving to Phillips is stepping up in that circumstance.
Yeah,
here.
I could see that. I think, it's not in. So I'll go like to the WNBA, and I think it's in other leagues as well. But to be a sixth woman of the year or sixth player of the year, effectively the first person to come in relief, you have to have started less than X amount of games. And I guess I'm just wondering, with a smaller sample size, obviously someone who has outstanding numbers, yes, that makes a lot of sense. And that is it, kind of like what we were talking about for forward, right? I think it's also, when you look at someone who has had a lot more reps, has had to fight through their team maybe not performing as well as they had wanted to, I think there's merit and value to that. Now, again, are those numbers significant enough to take Phillips off comparative to what she was able to do in the regular season? I say no. And as the league grows, are these things that are going to come up? Because you have to slim the fields at some point in time. And again, are people interpreting things differently? And should they, when it's something, as you said, Rachel, earlier, that's not most valuable player? So I don't know.
Right.
I don't know. It's
Right.
very interesting. I just want everyone to win everything. I mean, not really, but there's some great.
True.
It's true. There's great players in this league. And I just want, I hope that we can have a conversation and say, yeah, so-and-so probably could have also made this list. Like, that's fine to say. And in my opinion, is not disrespectful to the people who are on the list.
No, it's not. And I feel like expansion is obviously going to help because there'll be more starting jobs available, and it'll spread things out. And again, we've already talked about what is Ottawa going to do with Mashmeyer and Phillips if they can only protect one goalie conversation, because that's a bloodbath that I don't even want to be in a room for those conversations. But I think it's that is absolutely where expansion is going to help guide this conversation.
And I thought about, because you've mentioned this before on the podcast, Rachel, and I was thinking about that as we were watching CJ, because I think there's a longer off-season conversation to have about also how strategic, perhaps in favor of Jackson, her starts might have been, considering there is expansion, and this is a very good netminder who could only find 2 starts.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a home for Carly as a more, I would say, full-time backup role.
I would say so too.
Getting 10 games in a year.
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, I said my hot take, CJ absolutely could have gotten more than 1 start in the regular season, or 2 collectively. But neither here nor there for now. But I mean, again, is that something that's going to make a difference? Because on the broadcast, what we kept hearing is, we don't have any film on her. Well, now the PW does. So very interesting to see. And then for defender of the year, I mean, we talked about this. I mean, I don't know that I have an issue here. I always think it's interesting what people believe is the qualification of best defender, because true defensive statistics for teams, let alone for individuals, is very subjective, arbitrary, non-existent. I mean, I don't know, pick a word, right?
Right.
Fast, we talked about. I like that pick. Jakes and Thompson, while Lee Steckline is right there, is a little tough for me.
Yeah. I will say that Lee Steckline kind of came on late in the season
Yeah,
a
that's
little
fair.
bit. And so if you're looking at the
I
whole
agree.
if you're looking at the whole season, I kind of get it. I would say like the reverse is true of like an Erin Ambrose who won the award last year,
Hmm.
right? I would say like her scoring trailed off toward the end of the regular season,
Yeah.
and she was well out of the top 5 in terms of scoring for defenders, but I think that partially why she wasn't in this conversation again this year, despite winning it last year and still having a very good season this year overall. I think that it's just the trend of it probably affected things.
Yeah. I also wonder how much people think of the defensive performance of that player, or the player of the performance generally of that defender, comparative to how their team finished in the standings, because yes, I think especially offensively, Lee Steckline came on later in the season. We see what the playoffs have looked like. So,
Right.
I mean, fantastic. Like, if Minnesota wins, does Lee Steckline, if they win the championship again, does Lee Steckline care that she's not a top 3 finalist? Does anyone in Minnesota care? Absolutely
Nope.
not, because Lee Steckline undeniably has helped anchor that team and get them to another finals. And it's like, if Lee Steckline hadn't started that spree and that streak of scoring in the regular season, would Minnesota even be in a position to defend their title? It's again, I love these conversations, and I always really wonder how people make their choices on awards, because I don't think it should be cut and dry every year. I think every year should be situational to the team, to the athlete, because that's what, in my opinion, decides. Is it like you score 50 points and you're automatically the best insert category, despite the fact that your team couldn't get above 500? It's like, well, maybe if you played a little defense, you'd be in the
Right.
playoffs.
Well, yeah, and that's what's interesting, right? Because I think of these 3, I mean, it's kind of a coin toss, but maybe I would give it to Renata Fast. I think overall she's had the best season of these 3.
I agree.
But to your point about Steckline, the other 2, Sophie Jakes, Minnesota Frost, Claire Thompson, Minnesota Frost. So like you can't have all 3 from the Minnesota Frost. I mean,
Yeah.
I guess you could, but
Yeah.
I think how do you leave Renata Fast out of this
You don't.
conversation? You don't.
You absolutely do not. I think, again, defender is always a tough one for me, because I think most of the time we're looking at someone who pops offensively, because that's a cut and
Right.
dry way of looking at it. Otherwise, it's like, oh man, we gotta like watch film to pick this,
Right.
which isn't a bad thing. I would definitely be a proponent of that. But I mean, we spent a lot of time on awards and on this episode overall, because we're not going to catch you until we know who's going to the championship, and so we've got to make sure we get in as much conversation before that. But make sure, if you're not already, that you subscribe to the Locked On NHL channel, because that's where you can find the Women's Hockey Report once a week. Now, usually we will record, or we will post our recording on Saturday. However, we want to make sure that we are getting as much of the news cycle as possible. So that's why this episode is dropping on Thursday. But again, thank you for making us your first listen of the day. Check out Locked On NHL Game Night, every game, every night, until a Stanley Cup champion is crowned. Get local analysis on a national scale. And then, of course, you should check out Locked On Flyers, where Rachel is a co-host. Check out Locked On Kraken. I handle that. And I definitely talked about your Flyers, because I'm pretty sure the Kraken fired their head coach to get a coach that now is with Philly. So that's awesome for us. But for Rachel Donner, Erica L. Ayala, and we will catch you on the next episode of the Women's Hockey Report.